Before we start, why don't we go around and introduce, and we'll just start like, what's that, Hollywood Squares, So we use Zoom a lot at Penn State. So we'll start with Shanika.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Shaniqua Williams Roberson. I am an assistant professor here at Vanderbilt. I've been here for just a year, actually. My primary area of clinical expertise is in neurology, specifically in epilepsy, and I have a particular interest in using EEGs, particularly sort of quantitative analysis of the EEG signal to probe brain function beyond what we typically use it for, which is, detection of seizures. I am working in the Critical Illness, Brain Injury, and Survivorship Center, and my mentor is Wes Ely, and we are studying so my particular project, I guess I should sort of focus on, is in using EEG and the quantitative features of EEG to understand the pathophysiology underlying delirium and the long-term cognitive impairment that typically ensues.
Super, super. And I should mention that Wes is the co-chair of this mentoring group with me. So you're in good hands. Yeah,
Awesome.
great.
Yes, he's a really fantastic mentor.
Yeah. John.
Me next?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm John Newman. I'm a geriatrician physician scientist at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging in UCSF. My inpatient or my clinical practice is inpatient geriatrics, so primarily focused mix of medicine and geriatric consults focused on delirium prevention and functional decline. My basic science interests, so I run a lab at the Buck Institute, is around mechanisms of geroscience, so mechanisms that regulate processes of aging, particularly at the interface of metabolism and aging. I particularly study ketone bodies as signaling molecules that regulate inflammation and epigenetics and energy metabolism. My interest in delirium is as a translational research topic. So I'd like to get deeper into the study of the pathophysiology of delirium at this idea of inflammatory signals and energetic failure in the brain, and how we can better detect it or also develop new treatments for it. So my boot camp application, so I'm interested in both the kind of basic science side, but also the translational clinical research side. My boot camp application is called HIPS, the Hip Fracture Inpatient Pathophysiology Study, which is meant to be a longitudinal study of delirium after hip fracture, including long-term cognitive and functional outcomes, but also a multi-system set of biospecimens from which we can study the role of particular aging mechanisms like cellular senescence and energy metabolism and NAD metabolism in determining the risk for delirium and also the outcomes after delirium. My mentor for that is Stephanie Rogers at UCSF, who runs our inpatient services, including our hip fracture service. And actually, I'm doing that sort of in collaboration with another boot camp attendee, Sarah Lahu from UCSF. And I guess I'm serving as her mentor. So I'm in the middle of a nice little chain of mentorship here.
Great, great. And I know Stephanie, and UCSF is my alma mater, so I look forward.
Awesome.
Yeah, great. And then Denny Don.
My name is Dawn Denny, and I'm from the University of North Dakota. I am an assistant professor here. My program of research thus far has focused on postoperative pain and delirium in older adults. And specifically, I've been interested in the subsyndromal symptoms that we often see after joint replacement surgery. And my proposal was, it revolved around the use of a delirium risk classifier that was, it's intended to be used prior to surgery in the preoperative stage as a screening tool, and then testing that to see how predictive it is of subsyndromal symptoms. and then also measuring outcomes up to 4 weeks following surgery, because the subsyndromal outcomes are not well known as far as what kind of long-term effect, how long do they is the duration, and what adverse outcomes do we actually see with those subsyndromal symptoms that resolve. So I'm really delighted to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dawn. And so I think you've heard from each other. You've gotten a flavor of this, but you know, I tell Eva, this is what, Eva, your second or third boot camp, but I think you remember this when I was reading so I have to read all the proposals, okay? And I said, this year I'm really super excited because of the diversity in the innovation of many of the ideas that you've heard. Like there's someone studying resilience, there's several basic science, there's someone looking at, which is really hard to do, measure how the physical environment in the ICU might impact delirium. And so, you know, I'm really excited about this year. And so I think, you know, besides getting very targeted feedback, and this is unlike any other, I think, work group or delirium conference or geriatric conference or neurology conference that you might, that's the other thing is we have neurologists, we have psychiatrists, we have geriatricians, we have basic scientists, and we have nurses. I think I've gotten them all. Don't think we have any other disciplines, though we have in the past. I think we've had PTOT, but so we have a really wide, but anyway, this is unlike any other in that you will really, when you leave here, I believe you'll get very targeted feedback on your proposal that you'll be able to hopefully use to apply to another proposal or to a paper that you're writing or a presentation, and really have some good, strong feedback. So again, the goal of this is to, how many of you have mock reviews at your university, by the way? Well, they're a great idea. You know, when I came here and I've had continuous NIH funding since 2006. And when I came here, I was just trying to get funded with a tiny little R03. And our dean, who was new at the time and wasn't actually even like an NIH R01 type researcher, said, we are going to have a Center for Nursing Research, and everything, which Eva is part of that center, and everything is going to get a mock review. And that was really intimidating, you know, and it's still intimidating how many 13 years later, knowing that people get to tear apart my grant. But what I will tell you is it's a wonderful experience. And we treat our mock reviews just like an NIH study section for the most part, though we do allow people to perhaps just bring their aims page. But eventually they have to bring the whole proposal, and we score them and we discuss them. We have a primary, secondary reviewer. So if that's not something you do at your university, it's something to think about, because I think it's really valuable. It also makes people, keeps them on track to have a deadline. So, you know, if I say I'm submitting a grant in October, then Eva and Jen Hoffman or our associate dean will say, okay, you're having a mock review in June or July so that you can have enough time to make that proposal better. So again, the goal of this is to evaluate the scientific merit of proposals in a fair, independent, expert, and unbiased manner. So how many of you sit on NIH study section or ever have? So when you sit on one, and I sit on one, and I've also, so John has, and I've also been ad hoc reviewer, they assign you grants, and usually that's negotiable. Sometimes they'll assign me 3 and I'll say, you know, only 2, I only have time to do 2, or these 2 fit me better. But when they assign them, you do them independently. So I wouldn't call up John and say, you know, John, what do you think of this grant? You know, everyone scores them independently. And then we have to upload them secretly onto the NIH website, and then we have discussion. But when you have that discussion, everybody's in the room. So, you know, I might be the primary reviewer, but John or Don or Shanika maybe only, you know, read it very quickly. Yet at the end, everyone gets to vote on it. So that's important to know. That means you really have to make sure that everyone can, you know, that everyone can sort of get to the heart of it quickly, and that if there are biases or flaws or issues that you can address those. And then our other goal here is to prepare for the boot camp for your mock study section so that you sort of know what to do. And I will say, because some of you I think have had some questions after today, if you still have questions, you shouldn't discuss your proposal with other individuals, but you can feel free to reach out to me and say, just I'm not sure how to do this, Donna, and I want to, you know, not be mean or whatever. And so feel free to do that. These are the materials that you should have received from Eva. You should know what your assignments are. And Eva, stop me if I'm wrong, but I think everyone had 2 assignments. Is that correct?
Yes, everyone had 2 assignments.
Okay. Yeah. So, and then you should have a proposal review form, which is what you will fill out. And, you know, one thing I'll say, so I don't forget is, you know, this does not have to be a dissertation. So, you know, you don't have to write 3 pages on each section because you don't have that kind of time, and we know that. And so I'll tell you quickly how to like give good feedback and not have to, you know, under each section, you'll have a couple of lines, and you'll probably have more on the approach because the approach is usually the most important. But, you know, don't put 20 hours into this, you know, give thoughtful feedback, but, you know, we're not asking you to write a 100-page dissertation. And you'll have the guide. You can also go online. There's a link. The NIH has really good materials. And then you have this guide from Sharon, which is really good. This is from like 1990, no, 2005. I guess I'm dating myself way back, but I still look at this, you know, sometimes particularly when she talks about how everything should flow from your aims and how, you know, if you say something in your aims and it's not in your methods, you know, so it's a good overview. Couple of things I'll say is that, you know, even though we're doing this for boot camp and we're doing this to make you guys better, is that reviewing grants, and I'm also a journal editor, so send me your geriatric papers, but I'm also a journal editor for the Journal of Gerontological Nursing. But reviewing grants, just like reviewing a manuscript, is one of the best ways to learn how to write a grant well, too. So even though you may think, gosh darn it, I got into this boot camp and now I have, you know, 2 grants I have to review, hopefully you'll learn from those. And if you see a really strong grant, it's just like when I watch a TED Talk and I say, what is it about that TED Talk that I liked? You know, is it because they only had 2 really simple points? Is it because they started out by telling a compelling story? Is it because their evidence was really clearly presented? So, you know, and also you learn important pitfalls. So when you see a bad grant, you say, okay, I don't want to make that mistake. And the other is you have to know how to communicate across disciplines, because like I said, the people that are reviewing your grant, well, you know, you have your primary and secondary and maybe a 3rd reviewer, but the rest of people that are in that meeting, and nowadays, by the way, a lot of them are virtual meetings, they still get to give an impact score for your grant. So you have to be a good communicator. Again, one of the big things I want to do today is help you understand any NIH scoring criteria. So I'll ask, maybe before Shanika gets off, I should ask, do you have any questions about the scoring? Because that often gets to people. We're going to get to that in a minute, but you have to, I know you have to sign off early.
I think I generally understand the sort of the 5-point scale and how it sort of adds up overall. And I presume we're using a similar approach for the bootcamp grant review system as well.
Yeah, so we'll use the same 1 to 9 scale, which I'll show you in a minute. You know, and the thing to remember is you really are supposed to use the whole range. On the other hand, you know, I would be surprised if you're giving people 9s, right? Which is poor, very, very poor. I think, so where is that slide? Well, I'm getting ahead of myself too much. On the other hand, also be surprised if you're giving people 1s. And so, you know, if you're giving them 1s, there better be like no flaws. And that's in the slide. So if you aren't able to stay on for the whole thing, you'll be able to look at that. The other thing to know about scoring is that you know, the overall impact score is the most important, right? But the overall impact score is not an average of the individual criterion scores. So it's not like you add up, oh, I give them a 1 for significance, and I gave them a 1 for innovation, and I gave them a 5 for approach. And so, you know, blah, blah, blah. So now I'm going to give them a 6. That's not how you do it. And the reason you don't do that is because the overall impact score, you know, reflects, is this grant really going to make a difference? And those individual scores, some of them probably hold more importance, for instance, like approach. And that might depend on the score. Like if it's a K grant, you know, some of those other things like investigator and mentor might be super, super important and might bring down your overall impact score. So hopefully that makes sense. And then the other piece before, because I know some people have to be off early, is to say, you know, be constructive and be nice, you know, especially in probably more, I'll probably say this more because it's a boot camp, is, you know, always say some nice things about the grant too. On the other hand, don't say tons of nice things if you're going to give them 8 for the methods and approach. So your score, your comments should reflect the score that you give them in each criteria. And I'm going to show you some examples of how to state some of that. The other thing is to be constructive. So you don't want to, because if you think about the real world of an NIH grant, and I've had a grant actually that wasn't even scored. And then the second time around, I got a perfect score, a 1. So if you address the reviewer's comments, you can have a good grant. So you also want to give the reviewers some, just like a paper. So you don't want to just say, oh, your methods are horrible. You want to say, you know what, you really need implementation science to help you this. Or maybe this aim needs more of a mixed methods approach, or you forgot your power analysis, or you said you were going to do a pilot study, yet I see nothing here about feasibility or acceptability or recruitment. So does that make sense? So you want to make sure that you're nice and you're constructive. Same thing with a paper. Like as a reviewer or as an editor, I always cringe when people say, oh, this is a really well-written paper, or this is really poor. It's like, well, tell us what you liked and what you didn't like. This is what the process will be. And these times, I don't know if we updated them because I think we may have had to squish some of the times on them, but you'll have, the primary reviewer will have the most time, okay? And if you're the secondary reviewer or the alumni or the faculty reviewer, you should only bring up new areas that the other people didn't raise, because we really do not have a lot of time. Plus, they're going to get your written review. So only, and so if you're a secondary reviewer, you should not be explaining the whole grant to everybody all over again, okay? And you should only bring up the areas that the others didn't. And then we'll have some general discussion, and then people will have the ability to revise their score. So I might say, you know, after listening to Dawn, or after listening to John or Cheryl, I now want to change my score. You know, I want to go from a 3 to a 2, or maybe I want to go from a 3 to a 5. And then these are the times when we have the mock review. And the other thing I guess I'll say about mock review, and hopefully people that aren't on this will record it, is that, you know, this is Cheryl. Many of you know Sharon Inouye, and this is, Sharon's been my mentor since like the 1980s. And besides being a fabulous person, has taught me a tremendous amount. And one of the things she taught me is that red is love, you know, so that the people that really care about you give constructive feedback. And then the other thing is that giving feedback here is safe, right? You know, if we wait and you get that feedback from the NIH, then you're like, well, I worked so hard on this grant, now it's not going to get funded. So we know you worked really hard on this grant, but this is all about learning. So it can be a little bit uncomfortable. So when you're being reviewed, you're supposed to just sit there, you know, so you're not going to say, well, wait a minute, that's not what I meant. And I know I didn't put my methods in there, but I assumed you knew what my methods were. So you're not allowed to do that, even though you're there, because of course in the real world you weren't there. So I just say, know that we're a safe group, that we're your friends, we're your supporters, but we also realize that, and I've heard people from past boot camps says, boy, it wasn't easy to get critiqued, but know that everybody feels that way and that this is a safe environment. The initial approach, and this slide maybe seem simple, and I think this is from Sharon too, but I actually really like this because what I'd say is right now we live in a really busy multitasking world, right? How many of you have your cell phones in front of you and you're like, yeah, and you're glancing at the text that you're getting from whatever, from your dean or from your family members, or the other day I was meeting with a PhD student. I was getting texts from my son that there was a rattlesnake in the garden. So that was distracting. That was distracting. So in this area where we're constantly distracted, I'd say put away everything. And this approach, I think, will give you a better review. And it's, I call it a mindfulness approach. So put everything away, just read it through. You know, the first time you might not even want to be marking on it. Just read it through, get a strong sense of the aims in their approach. And this also might be an area you're not familiar with. So that's the other reason. And then read it through a second time, but this time take notes in the margin. And those notes will become your strengths and weaknesses that you type out. And then lastly, organize those and type them in. Or I assume people will type them, but I guess you don't have to. You could scan them in if you don't want to do that. But anyway, I think it's worth it to do it this way and not just to jump to the typing piece. So you're gonna be evaluating the appropriateness of the approach, you know, including the approach is really the methods and design. This is often considered one of the most important parts. The study design, the sample, how they're collecting data, the outcome analysis, sample size. If it's a pilot, are they really looking at pilot stuff? You're going to write up the strengths and weaknesses of each. And again, hopefully that can come from the notes you've written in your margin. And you're going to get individual criterion scores and then an overall impact score. Again, keep your tone honest, but helpful and constructive. The Annals article actually has a checklist for the approach that you could look at, just to keep in front of you to know some of the things that you should be looking at in terms of methodology. And of course, this may change if it's a qualitative study. It may or a mixed method, it may look a little different. This is the scoring table that we started to speak about. And again, and this comes, I think, right from the NIH. And, you know, again, somebody that gets a 1 would be essentially there are no weaknesses, none at all, which is really hard to do. It's also hard to do unless you're getting $5 million for the grant, as you know, so sometimes that's hard to do because sometimes we just know that there are some trade-offs. So, where do people score? I don't know, and again, it depends on the time, but, the NIH is probably, and people, NINR, most of my funding comes from National Institute of Nursing Research and the National Institute of Aging. And in those two places, depending on the year or the funding environment, you need to have a score that's between probably 1 and 3 to get funded. And some years it's even higher than that. Occasionally that might be lower if it's a special call and there's a lot of funds for a certain area like Alzheimer's disease, but you have to be in the high area. But again, we want you to use the full range of scores. But many grants that are even in the 5 to 7 range or not scored at all can be funded on the second time. So again, try to be honest and constructive. These are the areas that you will be giving the individual scores on. So significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and particularly we want you to address the feasibility in this because many of the boot camp ones will be, early grants. And so feasibility is the issue. And then environment. And then lastly, the overall impact on the field. So significance would be, does the project address an important problem or critical barrier to progress in the field? And probably the middle is the middle and the last are most important. If the aims are achieved, so if they do what they say what they're going to do, will scientific knowledge, technical capability, like maybe it's some new technique for using EEG, or maybe some new technique for measuring inattention or whatever. Will this new capability improve practice? Or will the new methods or technology significantly change a clinical intervention in the field? So, so it's not just, do they have really good, you know, well-written aims, but if they actually accomplish these aims, will it impact the field? You know, investigators, I think this is fairly, for most of you, you're familiar with most of this, but you want to know if they have experience, appropriate experience in training. We know that many in the boot camp might be new, either new researchers, new assistant professors. We do have some postdocs, or they might be people that are new to the delirium field. So maybe they don't have 10 delirium publications, but, you know, I do look at, you know, are they able to do work and then publish it? You know, if they're established or senior, do they have NIH funding, or if they have that in the past? The other thing which I think is becoming more and more important is the last box, the light blue one. And that is, you know, we know that, that all human problems, and delirium is a human problem, cannot be solved with just one discipline. And so many times you're working with multiple disciplines. So if you say, you know, I'm going to do qualitative methods, then you better have someone on your team that has some expertise in qualitative methods, you know. Or if you're doing a sophisticated statistical approach, then you better not have the statistician as just a consultant, for instance. You better make sure that they actually have enough time to do the work. Innovation, is it novel? Does it improve previous work? You know, I think things like new ways to deliver delirium applications. So it doesn't, people sometimes think of innovation as just like some new self-driving car, right? And innovation can be a methodology, you know, again, a new way of measuring inattention. It can be new animal models for inflammation. It could be new methodology. So at Penn State, we use a methodology called SMART design. It could be a new approach, you know, working with engineering or bioethics. Our innovation on a 5-year grant that we're just finishing with Harvard, one of our, two of the pieces I think that we said, and the other thing is in your grants, you should say, this is innovative. So don't make your reviewer look for it. So we said, you know, this is what's innovative about our grant. We're using nursing assistants to assess delirium. And we're using a focused ethnography approach and this and that. So make sure you say what's innovative. You know, the approach, I think Eva, you came up with these pictures, didn't you? So, but I was looking at this picture and thought, how does this picture represent approach? And I think it's because the approach is so important that the approach is the early morning workout on the track. So I've decided that's a track that, you know, so the approach really, really is important. And that's an example of why, you know, that sometimes that you might have all ones in other areas, but, you know, if areas that are super important, significance can be super important too, right? So if you have a perfect methods, perfect approach, but it's not going to change practice or change the field, then who cares? I like to say actually sometimes that significance can be your, can sort of be the death of your project. It's like if the reviewers don't think it's significant, the other things may not matter. So, you know, how is the overall strategy, methodology and analysis? Again, if you say you're doing certain analysis, do you provide the pieces to convince the reviewers that you can actually do it? And the other thing I often will look is, you know, every project has potential problems and challenges, but do they seem to understand the challenges? So sometimes you'll see people will say, okay, here's some of the pitfalls of the grant, but here's the alternatives. And then if the project is in the early stages, which many from boot camp will be, have they thought about feasibility? Have they thought about acceptability? Are they looking at recruitment? Can they actually do this? Another big one I see in approach is, they say, okay, we're going to recruit 500 older adults, but then they don't give you any background to make you understand that they can actually do that, So they didn't go to the university. Like when we did our grant, you go and you get numbers. Like we know this many older adults will come through the door, and based on our past experience, our colleagues' experience, or whatever, we know that we'll be able to enroll about 8 people a month, and this amount will say no. So make sure that they've sort of thought about some of these things. And again, in terms of feasibility, particularly because this group, we know that you may not have that, this is boot camp, so everyone's learning, so they aren't going to be perfect, but is it overly ambitious? Can the aims be achieved? Have they done any kind of way to convince you, or any kind of pilot testing that they can actually do this within the timeline stated and within the budget given? Environment, most people do pretty good on this, but I think, sometimes this could be an issue, particularly if you're doing basic science research and you say you're going to do something, but you don't have easy access to the equipment, or you don't have the expertise to run the equipment, or you don't, so if it's that kind of like the EEG examples, you want to make sure that you have access in the environment to all the things that you need to do that, and you want to make sure that that's written, and you have a fair amount of space for that. And again, overall impact, I think I've addressed this, but this is the likelihood of the project to have a sustained, powerful influence on the research field involved. So let's give an example of why you don't just add up all the criteria. I'll give you an example. Is let's say you love the significance. You're like, oh my gosh, if they accomplish these aims, they're going to change the field, right? They figured out some way to like understand the pathophysiology of delirium with inflammation that's just brilliant. But then you get to the approach and it's missing all this stuff about, well, how they are going to actually do that, or there are all these biases. And so you could have a really high significance, but then you're like, well, it's not going to have a powerful influence on the field because their methods are flawed. So hopefully that makes sense. And then again, application does not need to be strong in all categories to be judged with the overall strong, because you might say, well, okay, I think they can fix this and it's still really important. So I'm going to give them a strong impact. Or, after the discussion, you might say, okay, now I understand how this could have a sustained, powerful influence on the field. This is just this actually comes from the NIH. Again, in terms of the scores, 5 is a good medium impact application. And then the entire scale should always be considered. This is, this again looks at, if you give someone an impact score between 1 and 3, that means they have a really high importance in the field and they have no weaknesses. No or very little. You could have some. You can have some weaknesses and certainly be 2 to 3, but they don't have a ton of weaknesses, and they don't have major areas that would impact their ability to make an impact. So this is, again, you can look at this on your own too, but this will help you think about that. Examples. I'm a little cognizant of the time, and I want to have time for questions. So I'm gonna not read every one of these, but if you're new to reviewing NIH grants, I think this can be helpful for you to think about how to write your notes in the margin. Again, this application is significant because we know very little bit about how the direct and indirect costs are associated with this condition and treatment. This is significant because apathy is a really big problem, and hardly anybody has ever done studies on this, so we need to understand it better. Again, investigators, there's a long history of strong collaborations. The team is publishing together. They have strong biostatistical support. You know, again, just, I won't read them all, but you know, this research design of mixed method is very appropriate, and they've done things in their application to make sure it's rigorous, to address attrition, etc. Any questions so far on this part? And then these are some sample weaknesses. You know, like under investigators, don't put people on there if it's not clear what their role is. And again, I've seen this one a lot where people will have a statistician, but they're trying to cut the budget, and so they only have them at the end. And we all know that that's a mistake, because by then it's too late. You know, and what about your data quality and your inter-rater reliability checks and all that kind of stuff? Again, this is an example, a good example of environment. You know, it's how you're shipping or storing samples is not clear, or if you don't have equipment. Again, I'm not going to read all these, and sometimes they'll comment on new investigators. Jargon, just a note to stay away from extensive jargon. I know in nursing we have a lot of jargon. So again, remember when I start out saying that there will be people, you know, when I'm on study sections, it's nurses and basic scientists and neurologists and psychiatrists. So you want to make sure that you're not using jargon that they won't understand. A little bit of word about the idea of rigor and premise, which we'll ask you to talk a little bit about that as appropriate. This is a sort of new NIH thing, or at least new from the lot. It's not so new anymore, but it's new the last couple of years. So rigor is really the research approach. You know, are they using the scientific method? Do they have adequate power or controls? Are they reducing bias? And premise would be the quality and strength of the prior research, and the strengths and the weaknesses of prior work. So some people say, well, does that mean that it can't be innovative? Because sometimes innovative things, you know, you don't have, they're more risky. But again, even if things are innovative or risky, there should be some premise underlying why you've proposed to do this research. Again, just some more things about scientific premise. This is often found in the significance section in the review of the literature. So it's about the quality of the supporting evidence. The other one, so again, rigor, and you know, and this is the same if it's qualitative, you know, are the methods rigorous and sound, and are they clear? This just addresses relevant biological variables that there is a section in NIH grants where you address this. You know, if males and females aren't including, is there a scientific reason why they're not? A plan for presentation of results that are sex stratified, and that there be adequate, actually, there doesn't need to be adequate power to test the main or modification effects. And it does, and it can influence the overall score. Again, so what happens at boot camp, you know, I should say too that you'll have other opportunities after the mock review to ask questions. So then you can ask any kind of questions, but during the actual mock review, we will try to treat it as a study section. Again, each reviewer will have time to present, but the second and subsequent reviewers should only talk about things that are new, and you will get all the written comments. You may not get them right away, because I know sometimes there's a tiny delay, and you'll be a fly on the wall. But one of the things people have said in the past is they want more networking time. So hopefully you'll have plenty of networking time to ask questions later, or to say, okay, you said this was a problem, but how can I address it? You know, what can I do differently? So remember, it's both art and science. Be constructive, be kind, have fun, and know that good science depends on people sometimes being a little critical and also being supportive. So that's the end of mine. Eva, what are the dates? Do you want to wait to tell them that? Did you tell them when they needed to have their grant reviews in back to us?
It's not in front of me.
Okay, that's fine then.
I think it is September either 23rd or 24th, we said.
That's what I'm thinking too, is
Yeah.
the end of September. So you have, you know, again, I think we wanted to make sure you had at least 4 weeks after this, and you might have already started them, which is fine. But you plan, and again, I was going to show you an actual, yeah, I think I can do this because it has no names on it. This is this is my review. So, you know, this is last year's, but I didn't write, you know, 50 pages. In these comments, first I read it all the way through, and then I made comments under each section, and then I, you know, typed it up. I mean, if you don't, you can not type it up, but, you know, typing up is probably more useful for the people you're giving the feedback to. But, you know, again, it doesn't have to be 15 pages. Any questions, comments, or additions, things? Some of you might be reviewers and you know things I missed. So please, it's all teach, all learn environment. So please jump in.
I just want to thank you for the resources to help us with the process. And I don't have any questions yet, but I might along the way. And so it's good to know who I can reach out to. So thank you.
Can I ask a question partly about writing, partly about reviewing, about preliminary data and this idea of talking about the premise up front? But I've seen applications where people put preliminary data all in the beginning around the premise, and sometimes at the front of the methods altogether, sometimes spread out in the aims. I was wondering if you have thoughts or opinions or what you like to see when you're reviewing.
I was going to say that's a great question, and I'm trying to remember. I know for sure my first couple of successful NIH grants, I had it all in one section in the beginning. I think right after like the review of evidence and literature, and I would say, you know, these are pilot studies, but I believe the last one, and I'm glad to share examples of successful grants with people. So if you wanted to do that, I can look back and share that with you because this grant's done. But I think with that last one, we did it by aim, you know, and we did everything by aim. So we would present the aim and do, so that was a little bit of change from what I had done at the past. So I think probably both of them work, you know, and sometimes I'd say the other thing is, I personally, at least for the NIH, think that even when they tell you you don't need pilot data, I don't know that I believe that. I think it's really you know, publications are your currency. You know, Sharon, who's been the world's best mentor for me, you know, told me early on, you're not publishing enough, you need to publish more, and I did that. So I think publishing is your currency. But I think even if they tell you, oh, you don't need pilot data for this grant call, I think you do. Now, I think what you can do is you don't have to have pilot grant for every tiny little piece of the grant. So, you know, I think with this last grant, we got funded called READY, Researching Efficient Approaches to Delirium Identification. After we got our score back, which was, I don't know, it was a 3 or 4. And then we actually came back with that one with a 1 too. But after we got our score back, we said, okay, we need some pilot data. And so myself and the other project director, Jane McDowell, collected, well, on the other side too. So we decided we need it from both BI and Mount Nittany or Penn State. And so we did 15 people, you know. And in my last grant, I think I also did, actually in the last grant, I think I only did 10. And I didn't do every single piece of the grant just because I couldn't, but I was able to show them, you know, we know what the major issues are and we know we can do this. Does that help you? Does that address it? Yeah, and I'll try to see if I have a good example I could share with you. Good question. Cheryl, did you want to come off mute and tell a little bit about your background and area?
I think I was in the 2017 group in Boston, the last time you were in Boston.
Yeah, super, super. And I was still just observing then, but yeah, well, we're thrilled to have you back. And what is your topic area? What's your,
So I'm a professor at Rutgers in New Jersey, and I've been writing and researching on delirium topics for about 5 or 6 years now with my colleague who is a pediatric nurse practitioner. So some of our publications are generalized and some of them are in the area of pediatric delirium, which many of my pediatric friends tell me don't exist. But we have tried to change their minds on that a little bit. Yeah.
yeah, wonderful. Yeah. And we've had quite, I think Sean Barnes, you probably know Sean. But
Yes.
we've had quite
Yes, Sean was in my group.
great. So he might be coming back. He's been here in the past, but this is an area that's really growing. So we're glad that you're in the pediatric field. That's important. Okay, well, super. I think I'm trying. My New Year's resolution is to try and start meetings almost on time and finish on time. So I think if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and thanks for attending, and I can't wait to meet everyone.